It was after midnight, and it was raining hard. On the western causeway of Tenochtitlan, in the shallow black water of Lake Texcoco, a woman had come out to draw water. She looked up. Something was moving on the road above her. A long, silent column of men, dragging horses and cannons and folded wooden bridges through the dark. She screamed. Within minutes, the great snakeskin drum on top of the Templo Mayor was pounding. Conch shells were shrieking from every rooftop on the island, and from every canal and every canoe landing. Thousands of Mexica warriors were pouring out into the water, into the rain, closing in on the Spanish column that had thought it could slip out unseen. The date was the 30th of June, 1520. By dawn, more than half the Spanish expedition would be dead, cut down on the causeway, drowned in the canal, or taken alive to be sacrificed on top of the pyramid they had just tried to rob. But not all of them. A wounded, exhausted corps of survivors, including their commander, Hernán Cortés, would somehow claw their way out to the mainland and disappear into the mountains. And that is where the whole story turns. Because if you look carefully at that night, at the numbers, at the geography, at the political decisions made by the men and women who nearly ended the Spanish conquest right there on the causeway, you start to realize something uncomfortable. The conquest of Mexico wasn't inevitable. It very nearly didn't happen. The Aztec Empire came within a few hours and a few thousand meters of erasing Cortés from history entirely. So the question is, what if the Mexica had killed him at the water's edge? What if the survivors had never made it home? Would Mexico have remained an indigenous world? Would Spain have simply come back a decade later and finished the job? Or was there something already moving through the valley that summer? Invisible, silent, impossible to stop. That would have doomed Tenochtitlan no matter who was giving orders on the Spanish side. To answer that, we have to go back to a small fleet of ships slipping out of Havana in the winter of 1519 and to the man commanding them who was already at that moment a criminal. On the 10th of February, 1519, 11 ships left the coast of Cuba. On board were about 530 European soldiers, 100 sailors, 16 horses, some cannon, and a large collection of illusions. The commander was a 34-year-old man named Hernán Cortés, and the fleet was technically in mutiny. Cortés had been sent by Diego Velázquez, the Spanish governor of Cuba, to explore the coast of what is now Mexico. Trade reconnaissance, maybe a small settlement, nothing more. But at the last moment, Velázquez had gotten nervous, worried, probably rightly, that Cortés intended to keep any wealth he found for himself. He tried to cancel the expedition. Cortés sailed anyway. That single decision is the reason the entire conquest of Mexico happened the way it did. Because from the moment those ships left Havana, Cortés was legally a traitor. If he came home empty-handed, or even just modestly successful, he would be arrested and executed. His only escape was to conquer something so enormous and to send home so much gold that the Emperor of Spain, Charles V, would have no choice but to pardon him retroactively. He wasn't looking for the Aztec Empire, he needed it. Now what was he sailing into? To the Spanish, Mexico was a coastline, nothing more. They had no idea what lay behind the mountains. But behind the mountains, in a high volcanic basin 50 miles across, sat one of the largest cities on Earth, Tenochtitlan. It was an island. About 200,000 people lived there, more than any city in Europe, except perhaps Constantinople. It was built on a chain of small islets and a shallow lake, expanded outward with artificial land, and connected to the mainland by 3 long stone causeways, one running north to Tepeyac, one west to Tlacopan, one south to Iztapalapa. Each causeway was punctuated by wooden drawbridges so that at any moment the defenders could pull up the bridges and turn the city into an untouchable fortress in the middle of a lake. Hold that geography in your head, because 5 months later, it is going to matter enormously. Tenochtitlan was the capital of a political system historians call the Aztec Triple Alliance, an alliance of 3 city-states, of which Tenochtitlan was overwhelmingly the largest. And here we have to be careful with words, because the popular image of the Aztec Empire is misleading. This was not a centralized state like France or Spain. It was not an empire in the Roman sense, with governors and standing armies stationed in every province. It was what scholars call a hegemonic tributary empire, a network of more than 300 subject city-states called Altepetl. They were left largely to run themselves, as long as they paid tribute in gold, cotton, cacao feathers, and sometimes captives for sacrifice. The threat was violence, not administration. Fail to pay, and a Mexica army would arrive, burn your temples, and take your leaders. Pay on time, and you were left alone. And here is why that structure matters. An empire held together by fear can hold a lot of territory, but it does not hold loyalty. When the fear cracks, the whole thing can come apart very quickly. And there were already city-states inside the empire and along its borders that were waiting for exactly that moment. The most important of them was Tlaxcala. Tlaxcala was a small mountainous republic east of Tenochtitlan, ruled by a senate of 4 lords. It had never been conquered. The Mexica had surrounded it, cut off its salt supply, and fought it repeatedly in ritualized flower wars designed to capture prisoners for sacrifice. Tlaxcala hated Tenochtitlan the way a man hates the neighbor slowly strangling him. Any enemy of the Mexica was, in principle, a friend. But Tlaxcala did not know that yet when Cortés arrived on its border in early September of 1519. So the Tlaxcalans fought him for 3 weeks. Hard. By the end of the fighting, both sides had taken serious losses. And it had become clear to the Tlaxcalan Senate that these strange foreigners, with their metal armor, their gun, their horses could not be beaten in the field cheaply. So the Senate did something very sensible. They stopped fighting and offered an alliance instead. This is the single most important decision in the entire story of the conquest of Mexico. Not a Spanish decision, a Tlaxcalan decision. Because from the moment Tlaxcala threw in with Cortés, he was no longer leading a small band of 500 foreigners lost in a huge continent. He was the vanguard of an indigenous rebellion against Tenochtitlan, a rebellion that over the next 2 years would grow to tens of thousands of warriors. The Spanish provided the shock troops, the Tlaxcalans, and eventually the Texcocans and dozens of other city-states provided everything else. Food, guides, intelligence, numbers, sanctuary. Without Tlaxcala, there is no conquest in the form Cortés was attempting. Not then. Not the way history remembers it. With Tlaxcala at his back, Cortés marched west. On the 8th of November, 1519, he entered Tenochtitlan across the Iztapalapa causeway, riding into the largest city he had ever seen, and was welcomed at the gates by the emperor himself. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the 9th Tlatoani of the Mexica, was in his early 50s. He was not, as Spanish myth would later insist, a superstitious ruler cowering before white gods. He was one of the most sophisticated statesmen in the Americas, and he had a plan. The plan was to bring the foreigners into the city, place them in a luxurious palace, feed them, entertain them, gather information about them, and slowly figure out what they were and what they wanted. Ritual hospitality was one of the great instruments of Mesoamerican statecraft. You could learn a lot about a rival by having him as a house guest. But Cortés understood the danger. Once the drawbridges were raised behind him, he would be trapped. Within a week, he made a stunning decision. He seized Moctezuma inside his own palace and took him into Spanish custody, not as a prisoner exactly, but as a hostage. Moctezuma still ruled in his own name, still surrounded by his court, but now with a Spanish guard permanently at his shoulder. For the next 6 months, this uneasy arrangement held. Moctezuma continued to give orders. The Spanish continued to occupy the palace of Axayacatl in the center of the city. Tribute continued to flow in. Cortés collected gold. His men, alarmingly bored and increasingly greedy, waited. It was a standoff that everyone could feel would not last. And in April of 1520, the standoff broke, but not from inside Tenochtitlan. It broke from the coast. Governor Velázquez back in Cuba had finally decided he had waited long enough. He assembled an armada of 18 ships and between 900 and 1,400 men and put it under the command of a one-eyed captain named Panfilo de Narváez. Their orders were simple: land on the coast of Mexico, arrest Cortés for treason, and take command of the expedition. Cortés got the news within days, and he understood immediately that the problem cut both ways. If he ignored Narvaez and stayed in Tenochtitlan, he would eventually be caught between a hostile army from the coast and a hostile city from within. If he marched to the coast and left Tenochtitlan behind, he would be walking away from Moctezuma, from the treasure, from the entire fragile arrangement he had spent 6 months building. He decided to march. He took roughly 2/3 of his men to the coast to confront Narvaez. He left about 120 Spaniards behind in Tenochtitlan under his second-in-command, a red-bearded, aggressive captain named Pedro de Alvarado, whom the Mexica had already nicknamed Tonatiuh, the Sun, for his fair hair. And here we come to a decision that changed everything. On or around the 20th of May, 1520, while Cortés was still on the coast, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan gathered in the great walled patio of the Templo Mayor to celebrate Tocatl, one of the most important festivals in the ritual calendar. Hundreds of unarmed young nobles danced in the courtyard wearing elaborate costumes. Some of the highest-born warriors and priests of the empire were among them. Alvarado's soldiers surrounded the courtyard. They blocked the exits, and on his order, they drew their swords and started killing. Nobody outside of Alvarado's inner circle knows exactly why he did it. He would later claim he had discovered a plot against the Spanish garrison. Few historians accept that explanation at face value. Most modern historians think it was some combination of paranoia, greed for the ceremonial gold and jewels the dancers were wearing, and the same calculation Cortés had made in miniature at Cholula the year before, that a preemptive massacre would terrorize the city into submission. It did the opposite. The Tlaxcala massacre killed hundreds of the young men who would have led any diplomatic mediation, and it broke forever the possibility of coexistence. Within hours, tens of thousands of Mexica warriors were in the streets. The Spanish garrison retreated inside the palace of Axayacatl, and the city closed around them like a fist. Cortés, on the coast, had just defeated Narvaez at Zempoala through a night attack, some clever bribery of Narvaez's captain, and pure luck. He had absorbed most of Narvaez's men into his own force, more than doubling his troop strength. He was returning to Tenochtitlan with roughly 1,300 Spaniards and 2,000 Tlaxcalan allies, the largest European army ever assembled in the Americas. Smallpox had come with Narvaez's men too, though Cortés did not yet understand what that would mean. He marched back through Tlaxcala, back over the mountains, and into the Valley of Mexico. On the 24th of June, he re-entered Tenochtitlan across the Tlacopan causeway, and the city let him in. That is the detail that should stop you. The city let him in. They didn't raise the drawbridges. They didn't fight him on the causeway. They didn't do the thing that would have been militarily obvious. They watched him march his entire army onto the island, and then, once he was inside, they closed the door behind him. He was trapped. His army was doubled, yes. But so was the target that Tenochtitlan now had inside its walls. And Moctezuma, still officially the emperor, was about to become useless. Everything from here on was going to be decided by force. For a week, nothing happened. Cortés had marched back into a city already at war with his own garrison, and instead of attacking him on the causeway, the Mexica had let him in and gone silent. No welcome, no delegation, just closed doors and empty streets. He got to the palace of Axayacatl. He found Alvarado's men holed up inside, hungry, exhausted, and lucky to be alive. He found Moctezuma still under Spanish guard, and he found no food in the markets, no water in the aqueduct, and no way out. Because outside the palace walls, a new kind of Mexica leadership was already taking shape. Moctezuma had been the emperor of hospitality, the ruler who talked, who watched, who tried to solve the Spanish problem with statecraft. That ruler was politically dead. In his place, a new voice was rising in the Council of Mexica Lords. His name was Cuitláhuac. Cuitláhuac was Moctezuma's younger brother and the ruler of Iztapalapa on the southern shore of the lake. He had opposed the reception of Cortés from the very first day. He believed there was no accommodation possible with these invaders and no diplomacy worth trying. The only correct answer in his view was to kill them all. He was in almost every way Moctezuma's opposite. Where Moctezuma calculated, Cuitláhuac struck. And in the last week of June 1520, as the standoff in the palace of Axayacatl became a siege, it was Cuitláhuac's strategy that was winning. Then, on the 29th of June, Moctezuma died. The exact circumstances have never been settled. Spanish chroniclers, including Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was in the palace at the time, insisted that the Spanish had brought Moctezuma out onto a rooftop to appeal to the crowds below. The crowds jeered him and threw stones, and one of those stones struck him in the head. He died 3 days later, they said, of the wound. Indigenous accounts written down decades later in the Florentine Codex tell a different story. They say Moctezuma was of no more use to the Spanish once negotiations had broken down. They say he was quietly killed inside the palace, stabbed or strangled, and that the story of the stone was invented to cover the murder. Historians still argue. What everyone agrees on is what happened next. Cuitláhuac was formally elevated to Tlatoani, and the new emperor, by his oath of office, a single mandate, destroy the invaders completely. Inside the palace, Cortés could count. He knew he had lost the political game. He knew there would be no negotiation. He knew every day inside the city meant more of his men dead from wounds, from starvation, and from the Mexica arrows that never stopped falling on the roofs. He would have to run. There is a story from that week, you can take it or leave it, about a Spanish soldier named Blas Botello. Botello was a strange, quiet man, an amateur astrologer. The men in the palace half trusted him with the kind of belief soldiers sometimes keep for anything that might tell them whether they will live or die. On the evening of the 30th of June, Botello reportedly went to Cortés with a warning. He had read the stars, he said. He had done the calculations. And he was certain that if the army did not leave the city that very night before dawn, every one of them would die. Whether Cortés actually took the prophecy seriously is impossible to know. The order to move went out that evening. Blas Botello himself would be dead by morning. The plan was straightforward and desperate. They would move at midnight, in the rain, under total silence. They would leave by the western causeway toward Tlacopan, the shortest of the 3 causeways, about 3.5 kilometers to the mainland. They would carry a portable wooden bridge wide enough for men and horses. They would drop it over each drawbridge gap, cross, then pull it up and carry it to the next. They would move in 3 columns, vanguard center with the treasure and the wounded rear guard. And if the Mexica woke up, they would fight through. Around midnight they went. Almost immediately the plan started to fail. They made it out of the palace and onto the causeway without being detected. They set the portable bridge down over the first drawbridge gap and marched the vanguard across. And it was at the second gap, a place called the Tolteca Channel, that the woman drawing water at the lake's edge looked up, saw the column moving through the dark, and screamed. Within moments, the entire island was awake. Conch shells sounded from the temples. Drums thundered from the Templo Mayor. War canoes shot out from every canal and struck the sides of the causeway from both directions, hurling darts and arrows point blank into the packed Spanish column. Mexica warriors appeared on the causeway itself, in front and behind, cutting the column into pieces. And then the portable bridge got stuck. The wooden platform had wedged into the mud of the first gap under the weight of horses and men. They couldn't lift it out. And that meant there was no bridge for the second gap. There was no bridge for the third. What happened at the Tolteca Channel that night is difficult to describe without sounding like exaggeration. The center column where the treasure was, and the wounded and the reserves, came up against open water in the dark, in the rain, under attack from every direction. Some men tried to swim across in armor and drowned. Some jumped in weighed down by looted gold and sank almost immediately. Some were pulled from the water by canoe crews and dragged away toward the pyramid to be sacrificed alive. And the men behind them, the rear guard, still trying to escape the city, reached the channel to find it filled with the bodies of their friends. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who lived through it, wrote later that they crossed on a bridge made from the wreckage of the dead. Human bodies, dead horses, baggage, gold. You have probably heard of one particular moment from that night, the story of Alvarado's leap. According to Spanish legend, Pedro de Alvarado came to a wide gap in the causeway, with the water rising, the Mexica closing in, and no way across. He planted his lance in the mud at the bottom of the channel, vaulted his full body weight up and over, and landed on the other side, alive. Except the story is almost certainly a legend. Modern historians have questioned whether a man in armor could have cleared a gap that wide using a wooden lance. What probably happened is much less heroic. Alvarado, like so many of his men, scrambled across the wreckage of bodies, horses, and baggage that had already begun to fill the channel. He survived by climbing over the dead. The leap came later because a heroic myth is easier to tell than the horror of the truth. By the first gray light of dawn, on the 1st of July, 1520, it was over. The numbers are still argued about, but the shape of them is clear. Between 600 and 800 Spaniards were dead, more than half of the men Cortés had brought into the city just a week earlier. Between 1,000 and 2,000 Tlaxcalan allies were dead. Every cannon and falconet the expedition owned was lost. Most of the gunpowder was ruined by the rain and the lake water. Of roughly 65 to 70 horses, only around 20 survived. And nearly all of the melted down Aztec gold, the reason Cortés had come to Mexico in the first place, the reason his neck was on the line, was at the bottom of Lake Texcoco. This was one of the most devastating defeats a European force had yet suffered in the New World. And Cortés, soaked, wounded standing on the mainland at Tacuba as the sun came up, knew that his expedition, his life, and his entire criminal gamble against the governor of Cuba were hanging by a thread. There is a very old tree still standing on the road out of Tacuba, a Montezuma cypress, an ahuehuete, more than 1,000 years old. Mexican legend has it that Cortés sat down under that tree at dawn on the 1st of July and wept. The Mexican proverb, llorar como Cortés en el ahuehuete, to cry like Cortés under the cypress tree, comes from that story. We will come back to that tree at the very end of this video. It is going to have a new name, and it is going to be very important. But right now, in July of 1520, Cortés could not stop. The Mexica were not going to let him get away. The retreat from Tacuba was a running fight. Wounded, starving, dragging his surviving horses through unfamiliar country, Cortés turned northeast, trying to reach the border of Tlaxcala, the one place in central Mexico where he might find sanctuary. And behind him, around him, and increasingly in front of him, the Mexica and their allies gathered. On the 7th of July, 1 week after the night of the causeway, the Spanish column stumbled onto an open plain outside a place called Otumba. And a Mexica army, thousands of warriors, drawn from Tenochtitlan and the surrounding Altepetl, was waiting for them. This was the moment the whole story was supposed to end. The Spanish were badly outnumbered. Their gunpowder was ruined. Their crossbowmen were exhausted. Their infantry could barely stand. What they still had, the one thing they had, was about 20 horses. And in open country, on a plain, cavalry could do things it could not do on a causeway. Cortés saw the Mexica field commander at the center of the enemy line. He was called Matlatzincatzin, and he was carrying an enormous feather standard, a bright quetzal-plumed banner that served as a command signal for the army around him. Cortés understood what mattered. He gathered 5 horsemen. He rode straight at the standard. The charge broke through. Matlatzincatzin was killed, either by Cortés himself or by another Spanish captain named Juan de Salamanca. The feather standard fell, and the Mexica force began to break off the attack. If Cortés had died at Otumba, if a sling stone had knocked him off his horse, if Matlatzincatzin had struck first, the expedition might have ended there. There would have been no obvious Spanish nucleus left to hold the survivors together. Instead, the shattered remains of the expedition dragged themselves the last few miles to the border of Tlaxcala. And there, at the frontier, a small delegation of Tlaxcalan lords rode out to meet them. This is where the story turns for the last time before part 3. Because in the Tlaxcalan capital, a debate was already underway. And the outcome of that debate would decide everything. The Tlaxcalan Senate was ruled by 4 lords. 2 of them mattered most in July of 1520. A father and a son, both named Xicotencatl. Xicotencatl the Younger, the general of the Tlaxcalan army, was standing up in the Senate and making a very simple argument. The Spanish were finished. Half their men were dead. Their gold was gone. Their guns were ruined. The city that had once feared them was now hunting them. There would never be a better moment to end them. If Tlaxcala killed the Spanish now, Xicotencatl argued, it could send their heads to Cuitláhuac and Tenochtitlan as tribute, a peace offering, a diplomatic bribe. In exchange, perhaps Tenochtitlan would grant Tlaxcala the one thing it had wanted for a century: security autonomy and relief from the pressure that had surrounded it for generations. Tlaxcala would trade dead foreigners for survival. His father, Xicotencatl the Elder, disagreed passionately. The Elder's argument was harder, more cynical, and ultimately more useful to Tlaxcala. He said, yes, the Spanish are broken. Yes, we could kill them. But why trust Cuitláhuac? The Mexica have spent generations trying to crush us. If we destroy the Spanish now, we destroy our only new source of leverage with them. These strange, wounded men still have something Tenochtitlan does not: guns, horses, and a reason to keep fighting. If we keep them alive, we can use them. And we can extract terms from Cortés that no Mexica emperor would ever offer. The Senate deliberated. And in one of the great turning points of the conquest, the Elder's position prevailed. Tlaxcala took the Spanish in. It fed them. It sheltered them. It let them rest through the summer of 1520 and rebuild their forces with Tlaxcalan support. And in exchange, Cortés accepted Tlaxcalan demands about the future of the war and the post-war settlement. The Spanish had survived La Noche Triste. But survival on the causeway was only half the story. They survived the weeks after it because Tlaxcala decided they were still useful. Everything that comes next, the siege of Tenochtitlan, the destruction of the empire, the founding of New Spain, depends on that decision. A decision made not in a Spanish camp, but in the council of an indigenous republic, weighing its own survival against its oldest enemy. Which brings us back to the question we opened with. What if they had chosen differently? Imagine the elder Xicotencatl had lost the debate. The Tlaxcalan Senate votes with the sun. A delegation rides out to the Spanish camp on the border, and instead of an alliance, it brings a demand: surrender your arms, submit your commander, and we will decide the rest with our neighbors to the west. The Spanish in this scenario have almost no leverage left. Their gold is gone. Their guns barely work. Their horses are dead or dying. Cortés either fights and loses, or he surrenders and is handed over to Cuitláhuac in Tenochtitlan, where he is stripped of his armor, painted for sacrifice, and taken to the top of the Templo Mayor. Or, even simpler, the Mexica catch him first at Otumba. Matlatzincatzín's feather standard doesn't fall. The cavalry charge fails. Cortés dies on the plain, along with the last few Spaniards capable of holding the expedition together. Either way, by August of 1520, the story we call the Spanish conquest of Mexico has ended, at least in the form Cortés had created. Now, what happens next? The first thing that happens is that Cuitláhuac in Tenochtitlan becomes the most powerful indigenous ruler in the Americas. The Mexica have not only survived the invasion, they have crushed it. The Triple Alliance is intact. Moctezuma's damaged legitimacy has been replaced by a new Tlatoani whose entire mandate is military and uncompromising. Tribute city-states that had wavered during the crisis have a powerful reason to fall back into line because a nervous Altepetl now looks at Cuitláhuac and sees an emperor who has defeated the foreigners. Tlaxcala, in this scenario, is in serious trouble. It has just spent months harboring a hostile foreign army, drawn thousands of its own men into that army's defeats, and lost many of them. It is exposed. It has no more Spanish guns to hide behind. Cuitláhuac has both the strength and the political reason to tighten the pressure on Tlaxcala that his predecessors had never fully completed. One plausible outcome, and one historians have considered, is that Tlaxcala is forced into a humiliating peace within a year or two. Not necessarily conquered outright, because the Mexica often preferred tributary submission to direct rule. But its independence could be badly reduced. The great anti-Aztec republic becomes an anxious junior partner in a restored political order dominated by Tenochtitlan. For a few months, this looks like a triumph. The Mexica have done something no indigenous civilization in the Caribbean had managed to do. They have driven the Europeans out. And then, in September of 1520, the ships stopped mattering because the invisible thing that had come inland with Narvaez's men and had already been circulating through communities near the Gulf Coast reached the Valley of Mexico. Smallpox. Nobody in the Americas had immunity to it. and it burned through central Mexico with terrifying speed. The exact death toll is impossible to calculate. But the epidemic killed an enormous share of the indigenous population and devastated communities across the region. Cuitláhuac, the anti-Spanish Tlatoani, the strategist, who had broken the invaders on the causeway, died of smallpox in early December after a reign of only about 80 days. In the world we actually live in, he was replaced by a young cousin named Cuauhtémoc, who would lead the defense of Tenochtitlan against Cortés the following year. In this counterfactual world, where Cortés is already dead, Cuauhtémoc still inherits the same epidemic. And that matters more than almost anything else. He inherits an empire losing warriors, priests, farmers, engineers, administrators, and entire households in a matter of months. The complex machinery of a city as large as Tenochtitlan cannot absorb losses like that without being transformed. This is the point where the counterfactual becomes genuinely uncertain. And this is where honest historians begin to disagree. The more optimistic version goes something like this. Yes, the demographic collapse is catastrophic. Yes, it damages Tenochtitlan permanently. But the Mexica have shown that a European army can be defeated. When the next Spanish fleet comes, and another fleet almost certainly will come, because Cuba is still a colony. Spanish authorities still know there is wealth on the mainland, and the coast is still within reach. Central Mexico is no longer facing first contact. Tenochtitlan has captured European weapons. It has seen horses. It has seen armor. It has interpreters who understand Spanish. And most importantly, it understands what the foreigners want. The next expedition lands on a coast that knows exactly what it is facing. In this version, the Spanish return perhaps several times through the 1520s and 1530s. But without the exact combination of advantages, Cortés possessed surprise alliances, interpreters, and a chain of indigenous political decisions that kept him alive. Each expedition faces a much harder problem. Central Mexico might remain indigenous for decades. It reorganizes, it adapts. It becomes a changing mosaic of surviving city-states, a weakened but sovereign Tenochtitlan, a chastened Tlaxcala, Texcoco balancing between them, all of them negotiating trade, diplomacy, and war. In a world where European ships exist on the horizon, but European governors do not yet rule the interior. That is one possible world. A world where Nahua politics never stops. Where indigenous city-states continue their old patterns of alliance and betrayal, but adapt them to a new reality that includes European ships without immediately accepting European rule. The pessimistic version is harder. Because even without Cortés, the diseases keep coming. Smallpox is only the first. Measles arrives in the 1530s. Other epidemics follow. The great Cocolistli epidemics of the 16th century kill millions more. By 1600, with or without Cortés, the indigenous population of central Mexico is only a fraction of what it had been in 1520. And with the population goes the tribute base. With the tribute base goes military power. And with military power goes the ability of any empire to hold itself together. A Mexica-controlled Mesoamerica in 1600 would not look anything like the world Cortés first saw. It would be a fragmented, depopulated, weakened region. And if Spain arrives in force decades later, it may be arriving in a landscape far less capable of resisting than it had been in 1520. So the most defensible conclusion is somewhere between the two extremes. The conquest of central Mexico might still have happened eventually, but it would not have happened the same way. It might have been delayed by decades. The political geography could have been different. The alliances could have been different. The shape of colonization could have been different. And indigenous political institutions might have survived much longer as sovereign actors, rather than surviving inside a colonial system. A Mesoamerica that successfully resisted in 1520 would have entered its relationship with Europe from a very different position. Not untouched, not unchanged, but not conquered in the same moment by the same coalition under the same man. Which brings us to the myth this whole story was designed to break. The popular version of the conquest of Mexico, the one repeated in textbooks for centuries, was a story about European superiority. Superior weapons, superior culture, superior faith, superior nerve. A story in which a few hundred Spaniards, standing in for the whole march of Western civilization, walked into an empire and knocked it over because the empire was too primitive and too superstitious to resist. In that story, the Aztecs were spectators to their own destruction. In that story, Cortés was destiny. None of that tells the whole story. The conquest of Mexico was deeply entangled in a Mesoamerican political war, with the Spanish fighting alongside large numbers of indigenous allies against Tenochtitlan. It happened because Tlaxcala chose to support Cortés, because Texcoco later did the same, because dozens of tributary Altepetl were willing to turn against the power that had dominated them. Spanish weapons mattered, but not as much as later Spanish mythology claimed. Steel and horses could be devastating in open country. They were much less useful on a narrow causeway in darkness and rain. And on La Noche Triste, in the water and the mud, they did not save hundreds of Spaniards from dying. Cortés was not destiny. He was a man commanding an expedition that had sailed in defiance of the governor who sent him. He made one enormous, brilliant, cynical decision to ally himself with the enemies of the ruler he was approaching. And then he survived a night that half his men did not. His survival and everything that followed from it depended on Tlaxcala continuing to believe that he was useful. Change that decision, and the history of the Americas changes with it. Which is where we come back to the tree. The ahuehuete outside Tacuba, the old cypress where Cortés was supposed to have wept on the morning of the 1st of July, 1520, became for centuries a symbol of the Spanish version of that night. It was called El Árbol de la Noche Triste, the tree of the sad night, the mourning of the conqueror,
God forgive
the
me.
pain of the man who almost lost
What have
everything
I done?
and later came back to win. In 2021, 501 years after La Noche Triste, the government of Mexico City officially renamed the tree. It is no longer the tree of the sad night. It is now the tree of the victorious night. El Árbol de la Noche Victoriosa. Because from the Mexica perspective, that night was not a tragedy. It was a victory. An invading army had tried to escape the city in darkness, carrying away its stolen treasure. And Mexica warriors came out of the canals, surrounded it, and destroyed more than half of it. The victory belonged to those warriors. And it began, according to the story, with a woman drawing water at the edge of the lake, who looked up, saw a column moving through the darkness, and screamed. For centuries, the story of that night was told through the man who lost half his army and supposedly wept at dawn. Tell it from the other side, and the meaning changes completely. Because if the Mexica came within a few hours and a few thousand meters of ending Cortés's expedition on a single wet night in June, and they did then, the conquest was never inevitable. It was contingent, precarious, improvised, dependent on alliances, epidemics, political choices, battlefield accidents, and a handful of decisions that could easily have gone another way. The indigenous world destroyed after 1521 was not a civilization simply waiting to be replaced. It was a living, sovereign, dangerous political world. A world that resisted. A world that adapted. And on one night, at the edge of Lake Texcoco, it came breathtakingly close to winning. The tree outside Tacuba is still there. It is more than 1,000 years old. It has a new name now. You can go and stand under it.